Obrigado. Quero começar por agradecer à professora Fernanda Palma por me ter querido envolver nesta convergência de disciplinas e vou pedir desculpa à audiência, mas eu levei muito a sério uma instrução que eu recebi da professora Fernanda Palma. Como ela é professora de Direito, achava que era bem para cumprir. Ela sugeriu que eu fizesse a minha conexão em inglês, o que me deu muito mais trabalho do que se eu tivesse feito em português, mas vou ler isto.
Os intérpretes agradecem.
Pois, vou ler isto. Vou fazer só, para perceberem que eu consigo falar bem português, vou ler só o meu resumo em português. E depois vou passar para o inglês, que eu tentarei que não seja muito shakespeariano, para poder ser compreendido pela audiência. Então vou ler em português o resumo, que está no vosso caderno, mas que permite introduzir o tema. Devemos a Leibniz a primeira utilização de uma metafísica modal para descrever o livre-arbítrio. O nosso poder de decisão não se funda, segundo Leibniz, em propriedades psicológicas, como a indiferença quanto ao valor das alternativas numa escolha, mas em características dos vários mundos possíveis que estão em conflito em cada ato livre. A decisão deixa, assim, de aparecer como resultado da contingência fundamental do arbítrio humano para se revelar como um acontecimento necessário na ordem das coisas. Desde Husserl, que a fenomenologia procura retomar esta explicação antipsicologista do livre-arbítrio. No entanto, Husserl não pode aceitar a naturalização leibniziana das modalidades. As diferenças entre o possível, o provável ou o virtual, ou entre o contingente e o arbitrário, reenviam, segundo Husserl, a uma consciência posicional, ou seja, a uma consciência que constitui os mundos possíveis, prováveis ou virtuais, e constitui-os, precisamente, enquanto correlatos noemáticos de diferentes atos de crença. A solução de Husserl, porém, mais do que clarificar as condições de possibilidade de qualquer decisão ou de qualquer ato que exprimisse um livre-arbítrio, deu origem a uma imensa controvérsia no interior do movimento fenomenológico. De Heidegger a Derrida, passando por Sartre, Hannah Arendt, Paul Ricoeur, podemos mesmo dizer que aquilo que distingue entre si as diferentes perspectivas fenomenológicas sobre o ato de decidir é o tipo de metafísica modal que estas diferentes perspectivas convocam. Reconstituir as peças principais desta controvérsia é quase como que esgotar as várias possibilidades de explicar o livre-arbítrio a partir de uma fenomenologia das modalidades. Este é o resumo que eu fiz em português, agora entro no texto em inglês.
Então, se a senhora professora permite-me, apesar de... Quem precisar de... Penso que está a ver se a tradução simultânea pode haver. Quem precisar pode...
O quê? As pessoas vão ter que
Acho que não.
ouvir a tradução simultânea
Não,
para português?
não.
Eu queria poupar os tradutores quando fiz em inglês.
Não é isso, não. As perguntas.
Não, eu tenho uma
alguém que tenha mais dificuldade.
Eu tenho uma dicção a Porto, quando leio inglês. Portanto, qualquer pessoa portuguesa percebe o meu inglês. Só fazer também uma pequena explicação porque é que eu vou trabalhar a tradição fenomenológica. Já se viu pela comunicação da professora Fernanda Palma que, por exemplo, Ricoeur é um interlocutor importante para estes temas, que é um dos últimos grandes representantes da fenomenologia. Mas eu não me situo, já uma declaração de interesses, eu não me situo no interior da tradição fenomenológica, eu não venho cá defender o ponto de vista fenomenológico. O que eu considero é que a tradição fenomenológica sempre pretendeu dar um contributo importantíssimo para pensar as questões da consciência, da intenção, da vontade, demarcando sempre da perspectiva naturalista que a psicologia ia sugerindo. Portanto, a fenomenologia ao longo do século XX aparece como o adversário de todos os positivismos da descrição da consciência, dos atos livres, como o adversário de todos os naturalismos, pretendendo, ao mesmo tempo, não se colocar de um ponto de vista axiomático, não parte de uma ideia formal do que seja a consciência, do que seja a liberdade, pelo contrário, coloca-se uma perspectiva descritiva, o programa do Husserl desde o início, é fazer uma psicologia descritiva dos atos da consciência, mas sem cair na psicologia, sem cair no psicologismo. Portanto, eu vou pegar na tradição fenomenológica porque considero que é aquela que mais contributos traz para este debate. Não é que seja a tradição onde eu me reconheça. Isto é um problema da filosofia. Nós temos que nos reconhecer em todos e em nenhum, e para cada tema encontrar os contributos que sejam mais relevantes. Bom, feita esta declaração de interesses, então vou começar o meu texto. In a note in his diary, which dates back to 1870, William James, the grand CFCUL, William James philosopher, wrote, and I quote, "I think that yesterday was a crisis in my life. I finished the first part of Renouvier's second essay and see no reason why his definition of free will," e agora cita o Renouvier, o filósofo francês espiritualista, e cita o Renouvier, onde o Renouvier diz, "The sustaining of a thought because I choose to, when I might have other thoughts, need to be the definition of a free will. At any rate," continua o William James, I have to assume for the present, until the next year, that free will is no illusion." Ponto. E depois vem esta frase que eu acho deliciosa. "My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." Fim de citação, William James. Sabemos a importância que teve a teoria do free will de William James, quer para toda a história da psicologia, quer para toda a história das neurociências, quer para toda a história da filosofia. Posso fazer estes pequenos comentários em português?
Free will.
Ok. In 1983, nos consultas era 83, mas a professora Fernanda Palma cita o Libet de 85. Eu na internet encontrei os textos do Libet em 83. Benjamin Libet published the results of a neuroscientific experiment on the execution of voluntary action, in particular on the relation between unconscious cerebral processes and the subjective awareness of volition. The experiment has sparked a debate on free will, which is still very much alive today. Foi confirmado pela expressão do professor Luban Tunes e da expressão da professora Fernanda Palma. After this discovery, is still possible to speak of free will, and if so, under what conditions? We are in an intellectual situation very similar to that one who led Husserl a century ago to the origins of phenomenology. At the end of the 19th century, psychology was dominating all fields of research. What scandalized the most the young mathematician Edmund Husserl was the project of explaining the foundation of formal thought through the description of mental activities. According to logical psychologism, logic is nothing over and above empirical psychology. This does not entail that empirical psychologists of logic are themselves logicians, but instead only that whatever it is that logicians know about logic can in principle be known by empirical psychologists wholly and solely by virtue of their knowing all the empirical psychic natural facts and causal laws that are relevant to logical thinking. Actually, in what concerns the problem of free will, we are not dealing with psychologism, but with neuroscientism. Neuroscience offers us a huge contribution to explain the possibility or the impossibility of free will. But can neuroscience neglect all the anthropological and metaphysical patrimony offered by one century of phenomenological research? In the beginning of the 20th century, phenomenology was just a program of research. Husserl was building a new method for the pure description of consciousness. But this method, with a lot of dissidents inside it, led to a monumental collection of work made by a set of Husserl disciples. Let me just mention the most influential: Heidegger, Sartre, Hannah Arendt, Derrida, Paul Ricoeur. So, now, 1 century after, we can complement the actual neuroscientist approach to the problem of freedom, not by refuting again and again its psychologism or its naturalism, but by convoking the best this center offers us under the name of phenomenological ontology of freedom. What is at stake is not just an enhancement of our understanding of free will and freedom. We are dealing with central concepts in ethics and law, if free will is the ability to transform thoughts and desires into actions, and if this ability to act freely is presumed to underlie people's practice of moral praise and blame, as well society's practice of legal punishment. So, let me, in a brief way, present the main perspectives of Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre. It could take a long time, because precisely this tradition, phenomenology, has been very eloquent. We have thousands of books produced inside this tradition. And let me underline also the fact that this tradition is built in a permanent system of dissidence. Each new philosopher starts by the refutation of all the patrimony coming from his masters. Is the case with Heidegger, the case with Sartre refuting Heidegger, the case with Ricoeur confronting Sartre positions, and so on, so on, so on. But at some time, they are dialoguing with each other inside this same tradition, which allows us to build some kind of a systematic approach, if yet there's no homogeneity inside this tradition. For Husserl, freedom in fact consists in the capacity of will to consent or not to a specific doxic representation of logical reason. The Entscheidung, the decision, according to Husserl, consists in axiological weighing up, concept in German, Wertabwägung, ponderação dos valores em jogo, of the objects experienced and represented by the predicative voice of logical reason. Without representations of predicative reason, the will cannot represent the objects of its volition to itself. Thus, the reason of pure consciousness is logical. On the contrary, the reason of will is just a psychological reason that can be purely rational only by means of the objectivating help of logical reason. Moreover, the values supplied by axiological reason provide the rational orientation of any choice. This means that every logical representation, in fact, can be placed in the graduated table of values, and the best fiat will be based on the accomplishment of the best value. Freedom, according to Husserl, is then connected to the logical property of reason, and it is not placed in the realm of instinct or emotions. There's a German quotation I will translate. So the will directs to the reality, and not to ideal reality, but an individual and real reality, reale Wirklichkeit. And so on. Wille, the will, is not just a representation of what is willed, but is as a belief, a Glaubensunterlage. But there's a foundation in a belief. So we can only will if we have a representation of some values, a representation of an object, and we have a belief that those values are valuing, and this object exists, and I am the appropriate subject to develop action concerning this value and concerning this object in reality. So as the act of willing has these two main dimensions, the dimension of representation and dimension of belief, of assumption, of agreement with the representation. But freedom can be considered as the final granting of an act. It is what lets the act be as it has to be. It is the axiological and epistemological choice related to what logical reason represented. I pass to Heidegger. We know that Heidegger tries to avoid all the predominance Husserl attributes to representations, and tries to think the will and the decision with no connection at all with any representation, and instead with the situation of any decision. This is situation in time. Heidegger is the first to take in consideration precisely this time dimension of every act of will. According to Heidegger, the only way of experiencing freedom is in the resolute understanding of oneself as guilty. Culpability, according to Heidegger, reveals our freedom, not because it proves we have free will, not because it shows we could have chosen other paths, other action. Guilty discloses another fundamental fact, that we are mortal, that we are being towards death. We are free because we are finite. We are permanently dealing with a strange possibility, the possibility of impossibility. And I quote Heidegger from the monumental piece of work, Being and Time. We have conceived death existentially as what we have characterized as the possibility of the impossibility of existence. This is to say, as the utter nullity of Dasein. Death is not added on to Dasein at its end, but Dasein, as care, is the throne that is null basis for its death. End quote. When we act in such a way that we understand ourselves as guilty, we experience the way in which our being is permeated by nullity. What is death? Death, but the nullity of our existence. But we can only experience the nullity of our existence when acting resolutely, when acting not through free will, but through decision. And this is the main concept in Heidegger, the concept of Entscheidung, decision cutting. The concept who inspires a lot Carl Schmitt in this decisionism theory of constitutional law. So we are free because we can make decisions. And decision is something coming from nothing. We don't need to weight possibilities. A decision is precisely the moment when we start acting, and we start acting because we choose not between possibilities, but we choose the impossibility. We choose death. So the only ground for our Entscheidung, our decision, is when we decided to assume that we are mortal and I choose my death. So when I choose to be a mortal and I choose my death, my decision is not contemplating possibilities, but the impossibility of all possibilities. And I will underline further on the importance of this concept of impossibility to understand what is free. Free decision, what is freedom. So the decision, according to Heidegger, is not the consequence of an excitation, not a suddenly act of beginning, but is the fundamental decisionism which characterizes the Heideggerian metaphysics is the opposite of dealing with several possibilities. Decision is resoluteness, is running ahead, vorlaufen, not in the name of one inside others' possibilities, but in the name of my extreme possibility, the possibility of impossibility, the possibility of death. He says, and I quote, "Only as running ahead does resoluteness become a primordial being toward Dasein's own most ability to be, because being towards Dasein's most possibility is being towards its impossibility, that is, towards death." End quote. A third chapter, it will be on Sartre, but everybody knows the concept of freedom in Sartre. Everybody was obliged to read Being and Nothingness when they tried to enter a mature life. So I will pass Sartre, and I enter directly in Ricoeur. May I? In the 50s, Paul Ricoeur wrote a major work in 3 volumes dedicated to the phenomenology of willing, Philosophie de la Volonté. And Ricoeur considered in this book the experience of free will as similar to the experience of excitation or indecision. Free will would be then, according to this book from the 50s, not the feeling of different possibilities I would have to deal with, but the poorest domain of my metaphysical condition. And let me quote Paul Ricoeur. It would be a great mistake to identify the discovery of possibility, which is my very being, with that of indecision. Possibility is not an indecision which destroys choice, but the power which initiates choice itself. Genuine possibility is one which I open in myself as I decided, that is in opening possibilities in the world by an actual project. The mark of such possibility projected ahead of myself is the feeling of capacity or power, which includes alerting the body with all its abilities poised on the verge of actual action, awakened or encountered by the project in the reality of the body. Let me finish this quotation. Excitation illustrates this truth in principle by a reductio ad absurdum. In the chaos of my intentions lurks the conviction of my powerlessness. In excitation, I experience not my possibility, but my impossibility, end quote. But Ricoeur can only reach this metaphysical ground of that feeling of capacity or feeling of power. According to Ricoeur, this is the main core of my experience of free will, of willing something, is feeling my capacity, feeling that I am capable, I am able, but he only can reach this metaphysical ground, not in his book from the 50s, the Filosofia, but only after his reading of Hannah Arendt. That's, of course, Hannah Arendt is independent from Ricoeur's reading of her, but I convoke Hannah Arendt for this presentation through Ricoeur's reading. As we know, according to Hannah Arendt, action is the third category of a threesome: labor, work, action. This is the basic triad of the via activa, considered in terms of its anthropological structures. It is by its own characteristic temporality that action is distinguished from the other two terms. Labor is consumed in its consumption, to work is intended to outlast its mortal authors, and action simply wants to continue. As Hannah Arendt writes in The Life of the Mind, her last work, I quote Hannah Arendt, "An act can only be called free if it is not affected or caused by anything preceding it, and yet, insofar as it immediately turns into a cause of whatever follows, it demands a justification which, if it is to be successful, will have to show the act as the continuation of a preceding series that is reneged on the very experience of freedom and novelty," end quote. Repeating in some extent Jean-Paul Sartre, Arendt says we are doomed to be free by a specific virtue, by the fact that we are born. No matter whether we like freedom or abhor its arbitrariness, no matter we are pleased with it or prefer to accept as always same responsibility by electing some form of fatalism. But this freedom, according to Hannah Arendt, that is depends on the fact that we were born, because for Hannah Arendt, freedom is the possibility of beginning an act, beginning sequences of acting in time, and we are free because some time ago we entered in life, we were born, and because we were born, we are free. We repeat this borning, the act of coming to life in each act we perform. But this faculty of being born is not the only ground for our freedom, according to Hannah Arendt. This natality, important concept from Hannah Arendt, and Ricoeur underlines the fact that the concept of natality is proposed by Hannah Arendt in order to oppose the concept of this, the Heidegger concept of decision as decide for our death, and for Hannah Arendt, we are free not because we can decide to confront our being toward to that, but because we were born in the beginning of our life. But this natality needs another condition. And this other condition is a mental faculty, no less mysterious than the faculty of beginning. That is to say, the faculty of judgment. So we are free because we were born and because we can judge. And here let me just remind the importance of the concept of judgment in Hannah Arendt, not only because Hannah Arendt was following real judgment, Eichmann, in Jerusalem, and wrote a very controversial book on this trial. So she was obliged to follow a trial and to write about the questions of guilty, evil, responsibilities, and so on. But also because Hannah Arendt realizes that the main faculty who underlines, who can ground our free condition is precisely the faculty of making judgments. And everybody knows the tremendous loss the death of Hannah Arendt produces in our understanding of her philosophical project on judgment. As everybody knows, after having finished the first two parts of her major book, The Life of the Mind, dedicated to the concept of thinking and willing, Hannah Arendt dies precisely in the moment she was starting to write the third part, entitled Judgment. It's the most dramatic moment in Hannah Arendt's life is the moment precisely, it was a Saturday in 1975, warm Saturday. She sits at her desk. She introduced a sheet of paper in the type machine. She wrote the title of the third part, Judgment. She felt a little bit dizzy. She went to bed, and she dies. So when the husband finds her, there's in the type machine this sheet of paper just with the concept judgment. She never wrote this third important theory about what is to judge and the importance of judgment in ethics and politics and in law. What is interesting in Hannah Arendt's heritage is the fact that this suddenly interruption of a work led to two main different directions. A theory of judgment as undecidibility in Jacques Derrida, and a theory of forgiveness as unbinding the agent from the act in Paul Ricoeur. How much time do I have? Ao contrário da professora Olga Pombo, eu estou com imensas condições para dizer o que tenho para dizer. So let's think about the way Ricoeur is reading Hannah Arendt. Ricoeur starts with the description of the metaphysical danger in every action, the danger of the so-called free will. The danger has to do with the character of uncertainty that attaches to action under the condition of plurality. This uncertainty is to be related, on one hand, to the irreversibility that destroys the desire for sovereign mastery applied to the consequences of action, and, on the other hand, to the unpredictability that destroys confidence in an expected course of action, the reliability of human action. To the irreversibility, and Ricoeur quotes Hannah Arendt, man has the faculty of forgiveness. To the unpredictability responds the faculty of promise. And Ricoeur is just dealing with Hannah Arendt concepts of forgiveness and promise in order to deal with this danger of action where we cannot be responsible for everything we do, and we cannot fulfill all promises we make. According to Paul Ricoeur, in this book, Memory, History, Forgetting, and I quote Paul Ricoeur, it seems to me that Hannah Arendt remained at the thresholds of the enigma by situating the gesture of forgiveness at the point of intersection of the act and its consequence, and not of the agent and the act. To be sure, Forgiveness has the effect of dissociating the debt from its burden of guilt, and in a sense of laying bare the phenomenon of the debt as a dependence on a received heritage. But forgiveness does more. At least it should do more. It should release the agent from his act. End quote from Paul Ricoeur. We reach here the de jure unforgivable character of the guilty itself. And Ricoeur writes again, I quote again. It was then in reply to this de jure unforgivability that we established the requirement of an impossible forgiveness, end quote. So Ricoeur analyzes this immense gap opened between the unforgivable fault and the impossible forgiveness. I quote again, everything finally hangs on the possibility of separating the agent from the action. This unbinding would mark the inscription in the field of the horizontal disparity between power and act, of the vertical disparity between the great height of forgiveness and the abyss of guilt. The guilty person rendered capable of beginning again. This would be the figure of unbinding that commands all the others. End quote. But I have to underline the fact that Ricoeur says forgiveness is impossible. And he adds, but precisely because it is impossible, we must do it. The capacity of beginning again opens the possibility of separating the agent from the action. And this possibility hangs on the impossibility of forgiveness. So for me, it's curious to realize that not only Heidegger is dealing with the concept of impossibility. To be free is to deal with our impossibility, what is to say, with our death. Ricoeur says to be free is to be able to expect from the other the forgiveness of the consequences of my act. And this forgiveness is impossible. Nobody can forgive another one. But because it is impossible, when it happens, and he opens again new possibilities of acting and beginning. And to Paul Ricoeur, this act of unbinding the agent from the act is not a philosophical aberration. On the contrary, he says it's based on the fundamental ontology which accords preference to being as act and as power. And Ricoeur reminds us that this ontology can be traced in Leibniz as well in Spinoza, Schelling, Bergson, and Freud. So, last chapter, Derrida. While in Derrida's early work, the concept of indecidibilidade, impossibilidade de decidir, com argumentos racionais. Esse é o tema do último Derrida. A decisão é sempre um ato de loucura. Nunca temos argumentos suficientes para tomar uma decisão. Portanto, a decisão é impossível. Os juízes lidam com impossibilidades. E diz o Derrida, é essa a grande diferença entre a lei e a justiça. A lei aplica possibilidades. A justiça tem que lidar com impossibilidades. É porque é impossível decidir com base em argumentos completos, em informação exaustiva, mas, no entanto, o juiz tem que decidir, portanto, a sua decisão é sempre impossível. Mas, no entanto, ela tem que ser efetuada. Mas o juiz tem que perceber que aí está a lidar não com o direito, mas com a justiça. Porque a justiça é justamente essa capacidade de decidir a partir da impossibilidade de decidir. So, o conceito de indecidible, não sei se consigo dizer isto bem na língua de Shakespeare, undecidability in the early work of Derrida, remaining strictly confined to the ways of understanding the aporetic nature of textual systems of meaning in general. Saúde. Uma coisa que eu gosto de dizer aos médicos. Saúde. Saúde.
Aos médicos.
But Derrida in the 80s, mainly in this book, Force of Law, he decided to think about the political and ethical implications of this term, undecidability. In this book, he states against the cynical interpretation proposed by John Searle, the same John Searle, on undecidability, as according to John Searle, undecidability was just an infinite play with meanings, nothing to be taken seriously. Replying to John Searle, Derrida writes, and I quote, "I want to recall that undecidability is always a determinate oscillation between possibilities, for example, of meaning, but also of acts. These possibilities are themselves highly determined in strictly defined situations, for example, discursive situation, but also political, ethical, and so on." End quote. For, as we went on to claim here, the undecidable opens the field of decision or of decidability. There is so decision only because there is something in the very center of decision which is undecidable. The undecidable calls for decision in the order of ethical, political responsibilities. It is even its necessary condition. A decision can only come into being in a space that exceeds the calculable program that would destroy all responsibility by transforming it into a programmable effect of determinate causes. And I quote again Derrida, "There can be no moral or political responsibility without this trial and these passages by way of the undecidable. Even if a decision seems to take only a second and not to be preceded by any deliberation, it is structured by this experience and by the experiment of the undecidable." End quote. If decisions consisted in merely applying rules, then we might well say that those decisions were legal, but they would not really be just, however exalted these rules or principles might be, because, as Derrida noted, there must be some kind of active judgment, something that escapes any regulation for justice to enter into the decision. Every true decision has to endure what Derrida again calls the ordeal of the undecidable. The undecidable being all that is foreign and heterogeneous to calculation and to determination. The undecidable was not, he said, some kind of excitation, some kind of oscillation between two contradictory significations or between two contradictory rules or decisions. It needs to be understood as that experience of giving oneself up to the idea of the impossible decision. Derrida meant by this a decision unfettered by any determination, any rule, any reason. According to him, this moment of undecidability was what made possible any real determinate decision in the world, for any decision was, as the etymology implies, a cut, an intervention into the world. It is because decision is impossible that we decide. For that reason, a decision is always a moment of madness. However, it is inside impossible decisions where we might find justice. That is, not in the content of some rational or legal decision, but in the madness that preceded it and in fact made it possible as a cut in our experience. So, Derrida says that the whole program of deconstruction is justice, because deconstruction alone is what can reveal the ghost of the undecidable in any specific decision. It is what reveals the necessity of that undecidability for any genuine decision. And as he says, and I quote, "This undecidability becomes our reminder of the promise of that impossible decision, a decision that would be free of all reason, manifesting only a justice of absolute purity, unlike our real decisions, which are inevitably made with an urgency that obstructs the horizons of knowledge." End quote. So, in the same case, in Ricoeur and in Derrida, Ricoeur says, "Forgiveness is the act of liberating an agent from the consequences and from his guilty, and this forgiveness is the real moment of freedom, but this forgiveness is metaphysically impossible. According to Derrida, justice is expressed in decision, and all decision is impossible. So we are dealing, both in Ricoeur and in Derrida, with a new concept of phenomenology. Phenomenology is trying to describe not the conditions of possibility of freedom, but the conditions of impossibility of freedom. It's because freedom is impossible that is possible. It's because forgiveness and decision is impossible that we forgive and we make decisions and we invent our freedom. Let me conclude. In the name of freedom, all the phenomenological movement refuses the concept of free will. But in its last chapters, that is to say, inside the works of Derrida and Ricoeur, free will reappears in the form of the impossibility of decision or in the form of the impossibility of forgiveness. Free will is presented at the same time as a central concept in ethics and law and as the most extreme metaphysical impossibility. And this is the paradox we have to deal with after 1 century of phenomenological work. It is precisely because free will is impossible, because a rational decision is impossible, because a radical forgiveness is impossible, that ethics and law are possible. Do we need a neuroscientific demonstration that free will is possible? Perhaps not. Or maybe yes. As William James wrote in his diary around 1870, and I quote again William James, "My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." Thank you.